And it looks like we're recording. Going to give a couple seconds for people to join really quickly here, and we'll get started in just a sec. So, okay, hello. Thank you for joining Museums and Race on our first virtual conference. Really appreciate you being here. This is our second session, Confronting a Legacy, Historic House Museums and White Supremacy. I'm gonna go ahead and start by sharing my screen, and you'll be able to see the PowerPoint presentation from there. Just one sec. Alrighty. Well, again, greetings. We are Museums and Race. I'm Levon Williams, your moderator. The Museums and Race's work is primarily designed to invite a more nuanced museum discourse, particularly around three pillars: oppression. And we define oppression as identifying the complex and too often unacknowledged ways in which systemic structural norms influence decision-making so that cultural institutions present themselves in ways that are unacceptable and exclusionary to many. Our second pillar is privilege, and we define that as pervasive assumptions of whiteness and wealth, which are counter to inclusion and diversity, and in fact perpetuate white cultural dominance. And the third is, our third pillar is intersectionality, understanding how race intersects with gender, social justice, class, and socioeconomic status. So again, that's kind of our organizing pillars when we think about the work that we're doing as a collective, as Museums and Race. Normally we collaborate with indigenous communities if we're having a conference on land that is ancestrally linked to an indigenous community, but because this is a virtual conference and we have people from all over the world, we really want to just take a moment to reflect on where you are and take a moment to think about the indigenous communities that are ancestrally linked to the land that you are currently occupying. Just give a moment of reflection for that. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We do have a few agreements that we like to start each session off with. And I'll give you all just a moment to kind of have a look here for how we think about this. Okay, well, we're gonna go ahead and get started, and I'll pass it off to your actual moderator for this session.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jana Shafagoj. Welcome to our session, and a big thank you to Museums and Race for hosting this amazing virtual conference. The session this morning was inspiring, and I hope this one is as well. I want to briefly introduce myself and let the panel introduce themselves. My name is Jana Shafagoj. I'm the Director of Preservation and History at a historic site called Morven Park, just outside of Leesburg, Virginia in the US. Maddie, would you like to introduce yourself? Unmute. You're on mute, Maddie.
Sorry, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Maddie McCoy. I'm the founding director of Slavery Inventory Database. It's a historical research consultancy established in 2005 with the mission of creating connections to those whom history has forgotten. The Slavery Inventory Database works with historic house museums and historic sites by helping them identify and interpret their enslaved populations and narratives. My research is primarily focused on the early African-American experience in Virginia. I've collected, interpreted, and linked thousands of pieces of historical data to identify and recreate enslaved families and communities. These discoveries help break through what is often referred to as the wall of slavery, and hopefully to build meaningful and relevant connections, especially for descendants. I am a council-appointed history commissioner for the city of Alexandria in Virginia in the United States. And I'm the head of the research committee for the city of Alexandria's Equal Justice Initiative. In my current project, I am part of the Virginia Theological Seminary's reparations research team. And I'm very happy to be here with you digitally today.
Okay, Peyton. Unmute.
Okay, gonna have to get used to that. Hello all, my name is Peighton Yong. I am a historian and project consultant who primarily works with plantation and house museums to uncover and record the history of the Black experiences at those sites. Most recently, over the past year, I worked with Preservation Virginia to research Black history at the Bacon's Castle Plantation site located in Surrey, Virginia. My job was to research the history of slavery and post-Civil War Black life on the property from about 1649 to 1972. My work has aided in the construction of comprehensive interpretive experiences that thoughtfully address the Black historical narrative that runs parallel to and constantly intersects with the white historical narrative of Bacon's Castle. To that end, I have been responsible for conducting research, establishing connections and building relationships with the descendant community and Black community organizations, recording oral histories, and presenting public programs on my research. At this point in my career, I am transitioning a little bit out of the public programs kind of sector as a project consultant, going into a PhD program in about 3 months. So it is very exciting to be back with this panel again, and I'm very excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you. Simone?
Hi, my name is Simone Jacobson. I'm a therapist in Tacoma Park, Maryland. I have a group practice, and I've spent my career as a therapist working with adult survivors of childhood abuse and neglect. And it's through this work that I found my specialty, which is working with African-American women, helping them to explore the intersections of race, gender, and intergenerational trauma. I recently published a book through Routledge with several colleagues called Understanding the Paradox of Surviving Childhood Trauma, which isn't specifically about racial trauma. It explores responses to all kinds of interpersonal traumatic experiences. But it was doing this work that sparked my interest in working with Black women, because when they did find their way into trauma treatment, the issues of racial oppression were rarely addressed. That's my professional experience. On a personal level, my interest in this work comes from because of my own family experiences. Despite my accent, my mom is white and English, and my dad is Black from Oklahoma. In my dad's side of the family, our history is rooted in the enslaved experience. Unlike, I think, my colleague Kevin, there is no historic house. My family were actually purchased by Creek Native Americans out of Alabama and were moved to Oklahoma. And upon emancipation, they were granted Creek citizenship and we were called Creek freedmen. But in the 1970s, that citizenship was rescinded. And actually, it was my colleague Maddie that found this information out for me. And we actually have a very rare experience of an enslaved narrative from one of my ancestors. So that's just a little bit about me. Kevin?
Thanks, Simone. Greetings, everyone. It's a privilege to be able to participate in this amazing program today. My name is Kevin Grigsby. I am by profession a social worker. I've been in that field working with children and families now for 25 years. I guess I have somewhat of a quasi-historian title because I wrote a couple books about African-American heritage in my home county, which is Loudoun County, Virginia. My first book was published in 2008 called Howardsville, The Journey of an African-American Community. And the second one was published a few years later called From Loudoun to Glory, The Role of African-Americans from Loudoun County in the Civil War. Maddie had talked a little bit, in her introduction about breaking that wall of 1870, and I feel a lot of my research and being able to write a couple books really involved being able to break that wall. I spent a great deal of my childhood in the community of Howardsville, spending time with my grandmother and older relatives. And that was a community that was originally established as a freedmen community followed by the Civil War. So I often attribute a lot of the goals and gains that I've been able to achieve in my life professionally and educationally because of the sacrifices that were made for me by my older family members and ancestors.
Thank you. Lori?
Hi, everybody. I'm Lori Kimball. I'm the director of at the Loudoun Heritage Farm Museum, but prior to that, I was the director of education and programming at Oatlands, which is, it was the largest plantation in Loudoun County during the time of slavery. And while I was there in that capacity, which is what I'll be speaking about today, we launched an initiative called Reclaim Your Story that had the goals of documenting the enslaved people who were there, finding out as much about them during the time of slavery and then post-slavery, and connecting to descendants if we could, and we were able to do that. And also to add programming and interpretation and go from pretty much nothing in terms of interpretation and programming to expanding that as much as we could over a period of time. And as I said, that initiative was called Reclaim Your Story. I'm also a member of the Black History Committee here in Loudoun County, and as part of that initiative as a volunteer, several years ago, another researcher and I began to document the enslaved community of President James Monroe, who lived here in Loudoun County. And so that's another ongoing project of mine on the volunteer side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Before we jump into our discussion, I just want to provide a little bit of background of how this conversation and this presentation evolved. Our title for this session is Confronting a Legacy, Historic House Museums and White Supremacy. We're asking historic sites to understand and acknowledge their role in supporting a white supremacist history, a history that intentionally masked and distorted the truth about slavery, that refused to recognize and honor the humanity of the individuals enslaved at that place, and a history that has perpetuated and encouraged white supremacy. It's a heavy topic and it's uncomfortable for many, but we believe it is absolutely necessary. Change is not possible without truthful conversations. So that is what we hope to have with you all today. I must point out that we are all still learning. We do not have all the answers. But here's our starting point, our truth. Since the founding of the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1789, since Philadelphia's Old State House was rescued from demolition in 1816, and since Pamela Cunningham saved Mount Vernon, the preservation and interpretation of historic sites has focused on supporting and actively disseminating a white supremacist history. Think about it. Think about all the historic sites where you've worked or visited. Are the stories focused on the 1%? The very wealthy, the successful or influential, or perhaps an event that has turned legendary in the minds of the masses? What do you praise in your exhibits and guided tours? Who do you hold up as an exemplifier of an American trait or ideal? It's okay, all sites do it. We are all in this together. You don't just have to take my word for it. In their 2004 book, Giving Preservation a History, authors Page and Mason state that, quote, preservationists need to confront undesirable aspects of the movement's own history in perpetuating limited notions of American identity, in keeping the history of migrants and African Americans off the National Register for so many years, and in using history to perpetuate white racial supremacy. Think about that phrase. It's not hate, it's heritage. But why has this happened? William Murtaugh, the first keeper of the National Register, wrote in his 1988 book, Keeping Time, that as individuals and groups, we look to associative history for reassurance during times of change. He notes that by the turn of the 20th century, the waves of immigration were seen as a threat by the newly established white middle class, who calmed its own anxieties through veneration of the past. We can test that idea. Think about the history of historic preservation, of the timing of societies and actions dedicated to preservation, such as Preservation Virginia being formed in 1889, and the National Historic Preservation Act passed in 1965. If you work at a historic site, think about who saved it, why, who did they save it for, and what story did they want it to tell. I have been in the field of preservation for over 20 years. I love this field because it's full of passionate and empathetic people who know that history matters. But if we look at the world around us, if we don't like the racism in our country, if we don't like the xenophobia, we need to accept our responsibility in the creation of this current society. As we have heard many times over the past few years, history museums are one of the most trusted institutions. A survey of over 122,000 people by the National Awareness, Attitudes, and Usage Study found that history museums are seen as a highly credible source of information. Our score in that survey was 78%. Only art museums scored slightly higher at 78.2. We're more trusted than other types of museums, more trusted than state agencies who came in at 60, more than federal agencies, 48, more than newspapers, 66, and more than non-governmental agencies, 60. If we are seen as such a credible source of information, then we have a responsibility for the information we are selecting to share. As I spoke with my colleagues on the panel about confronting this history, this direct and unarguable link between preservation and white supremacy, we realized that like Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step is to admit we have a problem. Admit that we, meaning our sites, are responsible for telling, supporting, and maintaining a white supremacist history. We must acknowledge and work to recognize the bias inherent in our American narrative, and we must commit to doing the work it takes to create and tell a more truthful history, which will in turn help us create a more just society. So here to help us understand the impact of telling a truthful history and provide guidance on where and how to start is our outstanding panel. And with that, I'll jump right into our first discussion question, which is, why does telling this history matter? Why does this matter? And Peyton, I'll have you answer first.
Because my work is very community oriented, to answer this question, I'd like to briefly share a couple of interactions I had with members of Surrey's Black community that best reflect my thoughts about why telling this history is so important to the communities that I serve. So firstly, at the very first public program that I presented at Bacon's Castle, which was in June of last year, I was introduced to a woman named Barbara Anderson, who is a descendant of the enslaved community at Bacon's Castle. As we spoke almost immediately, she began to tell me everything she knew about her family's history on the property, and most notably the history of one of her several times over great-grandmothers named Camilla Pierce, who had been enslaved at Bacon's Castle since 1844, so when she was about 9 years old. Some of the things that Barbara told me was that Camilla built a family with a man named Albert Pierce, who was also possibly enslaved on that site. And between 1852 and 1861, the pair had 6 children and resided in one of the 20-some cabins that housed the enslaved community on the property. And Camilla Pierce continued to live in that exact same cabin until her death in 1805. After Brett and I's initial conversation, she asked if I might be able to figure out where Camilla Pierce was either born or where she was originally enslaved to prior to 1844, because Camilla was taken to Bacon's Castle by the family of John Henry Hankins, who bought the manor home, Bacon's Castle, in 1844. And so I told her I would do my best to try and see if I could figure something out for her, and hopefully find a conclusion. And so over time, I was able to find a possible solution, and that was Camilla, and likely Camilla's mother, whose name was either Harland or Holland, were most likely enslaved at the Cherry Hill plantation, which was owned by the Hankins family in York County prior to them owning Bacon's Castle in 1844. And so at a public program I spoke at in September, which was hosted by the Surrey African American Heritage Society, I was able to tell her that I found a likely place that Camilla had at least lived prior to being moved to Surrey in 1844. And she immediately began to cry and get extremely emotional about it. And the reaction that she had is a feeling that you can't forget. It's extremely palpable. It's it's really difficult to describe how powerful and how meaningful it is to be able to provide this kind of information to families as a historian. And also, I would also like to briefly talk about a conversation I had with a man named Charles Robinson, who I actually met at that exact same program in September. And we had a very interesting conversation. He called me on the afternoon of October 1st, and he called me to apologize, which sounds really strange. But this 95-year-old man called me to apologize because he was not able to contribute information about his family's history in Surrey County for my research project because he said that he had dementia and he couldn't recall the details. And that struck an immense chord with me and reaffirmed the importance of preserving this community's history for me personally. And during our conversation, he described himself as a very proud history advocate, and he hoped that I would continue recording the history of the Black experience in Surrey, which I fully intend to do. And that hope of continuing to record and discuss the Black history of Surrey, Virginia was a sentiment that was shared by many of the program's attendees that evening, many of whom had lived and their families had lived in Surrey County for several generations. In working with Preservation Virginia and working outside of that institutionalized setting and engaging with the community, I quickly understood the responsibility that I had to ensure that their legacies and the legacy of those families would be preserved for future generations long after all of us are gone.
Thank you, Peighton.
And so
I'm sorry, did you want to add something else?
Yeah, well, just super quickly, it's just my purpose for bringing up those two stories is that we have to understand a lot of these people that we're speaking to are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and once they're gone, those histories and the legacies that come with them, if they're not recorded and preserved, they will be gone forever. And so that is the driving force of why I do my work and why this history is important to share.
Thank you. Kevin, I know you have thoughts about this question too, about why this history is important.
Right. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's extremely important, and, and I can only share, just from my, experience that, as someone, who's descended from the enslaved, for me, there is no old country, there's no specific town or village that I'm able to go back to and trace my family of origin to. So for myself, I often look to the experiences of my ancestors, what it was like when they came out of slavery. And in many ways, that was kind of a starting point, I would say, for our family's journey. I mean, during the years of slavery, I often equated it's just a matter of survival. And then finally, when the chains came off, and of course the scars remain, the pain remained, the trauma remained, that's when there were slow and gradual steps towards reaching, making some type of gains, trying to get their little slice of the American dream. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I'm someone who has had a tremendous amount of professional success, educational success, but going to a place such as where my ancestors had once been enslaved, and even when I've taken other family members there, I often remind them, this was kind of a starting place for us, and I reflect on what it was like for my ancestors who were there, and I'm sure this is the experience of other descendants of the enslaved. When you stand there, my mom also had an expression that she often said is, be still, be quiet, and the ancestors will speak to you. And when I stand on these grounds and I'm reminded of the pain and the oppression that my ancestors experienced, and then I think of where I'm at now, but it's just not, but I can't forget that gap in between, because going from the enslaved ancestors to then great grandparents who were only afforded a 3rd grade education to grandparents who only had a 6th or 7th grade education, living in a county where there was no high school for African Americans, and getting to the point of parents who could graduate from high school, and then myself. So when I stand at a place like what we're describing as a historic site, that was essentially a launching pad for my family, not to be revered, but I revere in the sacrifices that my ancestors made to be able to stand at certain places and know this is exactly where my ancestors stood in the kitchen, where they stood in the field, where they stood in front of the big house. It is extremely humbling when I then return and talk to my children, or I talk to my children and remind them of the opportunities that they have. So it's extremely important for those of us who are from, who are descended from the enslaved. It's very much more than just simply a historic site or just a museum. It's a place in which we come into contact with those who came before us, whose blood still runs through our veins, and for who we are forever, grateful to.
Thank you, Kevin. Simone, would you like to speak to that question as well?
Yes, yeah, I've written some. Normally I don't use notes, but today, because this is a slightly different way of doing my kind of work, I've got some notes. So I wanted to say that this history of historic sites and historic house museums, and the stories that are present within them are also present with us today, and particularly when people come into therapy. When I work with my clients, I'm helping them to connect the dots between the past and the present, between their feelings and behaviors. And I'm helping my clients put their lives into context, because when they come into my office, they often feel a little crazy. They don't understand what is wrong with them. So it's my job to help people feel less crazy. I help them to understand that the symptoms they are experiencing are a rational response to the traumatic experiences that they've been through. Taken out of context, they seem crazy, but it's in the larger context, they make sense. The research is there that anyone who has a history of childhood trauma in their home, it is most likely to be intergenerational. Anyone who abuses their child, most people do not abuse if they have been abused themselves, but anybody who does abuse a child is most likely to have been abused themselves. And even if one doesn't abuse somebody else, the ways of coping get passed down from one generation to the next. So when I'm working with African American clients, my job is to help them understand their symptoms through this intergenerational lens. Slavery was a systematic process of abuse that went on for many generations. And the process of prolonged subjugation was enforced by the destruction of family relationships. When we feel connected and secure, we will quite literally fight to the death the people we care about the most. So to keep a large group of people enslaved for so long, there had to be a system in place to devastate those ties. Husbands couldn't protect their wives, and mothers could not protect their children. These kinds of experiences are devastating to our hearts and our souls, to our relationships, because at the heart of all human experiences, the way we make meaning of the world is the connections that we have to those we care about the most. And the problem is that when enslavement ended, the emotional toll did not. There has been very little safety to be found, no cultural healing, only more racial oppression. And as one of my African American clients put it, as she was working through her long family history of oppression, is that her white counterparts who are also healing from trauma get to go out into the world and find some safety. And for her, there is no safety. The racial disparities continue. She has to figure out how to manage the constant assault on her person by a culture that devalues how she looks, acts, and moves through the world. She has to find a way to give voice to a culture that seeks to make her voiceless, and she has to work hard to deal with the wound of rage that is a legitimate response to her personal family and community history. Exploring these histories, telling the story of our ancestors is crucial in giving voice to the voiceless and hope to the disenfranchised. We all need to see ourselves reflected back. The most devastating effects of interpersonal trauma often isn't the abusive behaviors or the emotional violence. It's actually the silence of the bystanders. The malignant neglect that allowed the abuses to continue. And it's the betrayal, it's managing or dealing with the betrayal of implied consent, that those who knew what was going on didn't do anything about it. I tell my clients that when we start working together, we are going towards the pain, towards the things that hurt them. And this may seem counterintuitive, but this time they won't be alone, and they will have the resources they need to face the things that they couldn't when they were a child. But I wouldn't ask them to do this if there wasn't hope on the other side. I've seen people healed, content in their purpose, still bruised and sore, but transformed in their relationships. Historic house museums and historic sites have a crucial role in repairing the wounds that we still feel today. We can lean in, feel the pain, and move forward, knowing that we can't change the past, but we can head into the future in a different way.
Well said. Thank you, Simone. I'm going to move us into our next discussion question, which is, how do you make this history a priority for your institution? How can you convince your board and staff? And what about the fear of getting it wrong? And Lori, I know you've spent a lot of time making these changes at Oatland, so I'll ask you to speak to this first.
Thank you. It was very obvious when several of us arrived at Oatlands as new employees that the entire story wasn't being told. There was a lot that was left out. There were perhaps times when it was acknowledged that there had been slaves at that historic site, but there was very little that had been incorporated into any kind of telling that story there. And so we worked, perhaps we were in a sense a little bit more fortunate than some other sites in that there was very little resistance to learning more about the true history that was there, the full history that was there, the accurate history when we embarked on this path. And that's not to say that there weren't some stumbling blocks. There were, actually I should set the stage. This is a historic site that's open for tours. And there were a few docents who were not comfortable talking about some of these things. So there was a lot of training and so forth involved. We did have 2 people who quit because they did not want to interpret this story. We did encounter some of the reaction of, this is in the past and why should we be talking about this, it's behind us. But again, we had more people feeling like, yes, we have to know more and talk about this fuller picture and an accurate picture of what happened there. In terms of board members, there was never any kind of feeling of don't do this. There was some apprehension about embarking on something that was telling a deeper story than what had been done in the past, a little bit of a fear of what might go wrong, or if we did a program
I'm sorry, did we just, Lori, I think we lost your microphone.
An interest in learning more. And so we just continued to expand upon what we were doing. The other thing, I met Kevin early on when I arrived at Oatlands. And I think as we started to meet more descendants, interestingly, many descendants were still living in the community, in the county or nearby. And it became very important to be able to tell their story because it was the right thing to do. And so many people just wanted that story to be told that they had never been able to tell before. And it became not just a matter of this is the right thing to do for this site because it's telling a more accurate story. It really became, for me, we have to work together to tell this story and learn as much as we can, and also to connect people to each other, to find out more about the people who had been enslaved there, their lives after slavery, and then trying to connect to descendants and get together. So working very closely with Kevin and with other descendants. The first Descendants Day was started at Oatlands in 2015 and just grew every year since then and expanded. I think the last Descendants Day, Kevin, there were about 90 people at Oatlands from all parts of the country. And I should point out, we started back in the day when there was not much DNA testing, and so it was a lot of documentary research. And the research is there. We're fortunate that we have records in Loudoun County. We can go back as far as 1757, but also more recently, DNA testing has enabled descendants to connect with one another. And so that's been very special as we're trying to broaden with the Reclaim Your Story project and connect more people.
Thank you, Lori. And Maddie, I know you've done this work as a consultant for lots of historic sites, bringing the history in.
Correct. Yep. As museum professionals at historic sites and historic house museums, we can dedicate ourselves to interpreting a fuller American history. We can strive to actually be the change in the world that we want to see, and we can mean well. But well-meaning white people can often do more unintentional harm to subjugated groups than good. We, as the majority of us working in historic house museums and historic sites, are still white museum professionals. We must begin the process of changing the narrative with a wide awake and solid understanding of our nation's legacy of systemic inequality and white supremacy. We must acknowledge our privilege. To say things like, looking at new ways to think about our history or new lenses to see through mean nothing unless we start seeing the injustices that were designed for us to never see. Kenneth Hardy, an African-American family therapist, says this: one of the first responsibilities for the privileged is to overcome mistaken notions about equality and inequality. I believe it's customary for the privileged to just assume that everyone and everything is equal. One of the privileges of the privileged is to be able to be oblivious to the life experiences of the subjugated. I don't believe healing can take place in a context where the privileged have not come to terms with the existence of inequality. Not only must the privileged acknowledge the existence of marginalization, they must find some way to appreciate the inequality and the suffering of the subjugated, end quote. I have put together a list of 7 recommended steps for your historic site to take on the journey of coming to terms with the existence of inequality towards developing a more equitable narrative and moving forward. And that's where I'm going to ask Levon if you could please show the slide. Thank you. Number 1 is the entire institution commits to learning an equitable interpretation. You may lose people along the way, but you will also gain new volunteers that will be invested and enthusiastic in how you are moving forward. Number 2 is start reading together as a group, as an organization. The 2 books that I would recommend starting with are The Invention of White People by Jacqueline Badalora and White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Number 3 is to become an ally. Actively participate as an ally and become part of the change by bringing allyship training into your institution. And I can't stress how important that step is. Number 4 is responsible outreach to your local African-American community. Again, Kenneth Hardy says, furthermore, it amazes me when people of privilege say, I tried to reach out to this group of people, but they were so hostile and angry that I just can't do it anymore. I think that such statements are an expression of privilege. They are a cop-out. This is not true for people in subjugated positions. We are familiar with the feeling of not knowing what to do. We are used to facing hostility and anger when we step into unfamiliar territory. If relationships across differences are to be healed, then people of privilege cannot turn away at their first experience of rejection or hostility. 2, also, we often want to know how to approach these sensitive issues of race and privilege in the right way, but in a way that often involves the least amount of risk to us as white people. I promise that responsible outreach will become more apparent once you have started your allyship training. The goal is responsible engagement. Number 5 is research. I do this for a living, and it's only number 5 on my list. Starting research to create an equitable narrative at your site is number 5, again, not number 1. Number 6 is programming. Better and more relevant programming will become more apparent once you have started your allyship journey. This in turn will attract new visitors. And number 7 is continuing education, but forever. This is not one and done. Commit to yearly or biannual training. And I strongly recommend that mental health professionals, preferably mental health professionals of color, be at the table as healers and facilitators each step of the way. They are trained to handle emotions in a responsible way without adding to the hurt of the subjugated communities, and can help the more privileged communities to identify and lean into the discomfort that will arise. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. We're going to move on to our third topic of conversation, which is how can you give back this history? How do you respectfully engage with descendants? How can you present your research in a way that honors and respects the historic individuals and their descendants? And who would like to speak first to that? Anyone? Peyton, would you like to go first? Peyton, you need to unmute.
Yeah, like I said before, a large part of my work is very community oriented, and part of the reason why that is because I, as a Black individual, and trying to uncover the history of my family, all the different segments of my family, it can be an extremely difficult task to undertake, and there's a lot of Black scholars and Black individuals that understand that is the case. And so as a historian, as far as giving back my history or the work that I do to the community is first and foremost is putting the needs of the descendants and the members of the community first before anything and anyone else. And so that means making my research as accessible as humanly possible. That means the good, the bad, the ugly aspects of that history is ensuring that it's accessible. And this can be done in so many different ways by hosting regular public programs that keep the information alive, creating databases, having blogs and other kind of online services that allow interested parties to continue to add to and access the information freely. And also, as someone who works with the descendant community frequently, when I'm working at historical sites, some of the things that I do and some of the things that I kind of have to engage with as a historian is oftentimes when I'm going in with a kind of baseline project of I'm going to try and research the history, the Black history of this site. Oftentimes when I'm talking to the community, a question that I'll get pretty frequently is, can you dig into the history of my particular family or this particular ancestor? And that's something that's always part of the process. And it can be a very, it can be a difficult aspect of the process because you don't know what you're going to find. You don't know if you're going to unearth something that might be traumatic or something that they do not want to hear. That's something that I had to face. For example, a family who comes from a largely free Black ancestry, I had to tell them that 2 of their descendants were enslaved people after doing research and finding their names in records of enslaved people, to put a long story short, and that can be difficult. But giving access to the reports that you create and being in contact every step of the way. I mean, most of the descendants that I've spoken to, I'm still friends with today and talked to. I've had, shared meals with, gone to organization meetings with them, and engaging is just, it's an incredible experience. And it's something that you have to do in order to make meaningful projects and to make meaningful use of the material that's going to be used at these historical sites for interpretations and future projects.
Thank you, Peyton. Maddie, do you have anything you'd like to, or Kevin, do you want to add something? Sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. If I can wait for Maddie.
Okay, Maddie, would you like to add?
I'll just say very quickly, how do we share, how do we give back this history? How do we present our research? Often, and I think this may be in the question and answer in the chat, we're talking about material culture and the intersection of history and genealogy and archaeology, and how do we identify and how do we give back as far as when there's no material culture left or very little. And when I look to that, I look at one thing that we can identify from the records are names. And it really, at the end of the day, it comes down to me for my research, but then sharing are the names of individuals who were enslaved. If we can identify people, make family groups and put them on a landscape, that may be that may be all we can actually achieve as researchers, as historians. We may be able to identify in the landscape where slave quarters were, where workspaces were, and that type of thing. But it is very hard to give back when you don't have items or material culture that's still available today to look at. And so it becomes this abstract thing, and yet giving names to individuals then creates, recreates that identity to some extent as well, and honors them as well. Sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is actually one where it really does resonate with me, as someone who was able to extract a tremendous amount of information, from the site, where Lori had once worked. But I think it's also very important, to understand, especially for those of you who are in the field, is when Lori was talking about everything that she had to do, that took courage. So I don't want to minimize that. I mean, you could hear as she described it that there were some barriers that had to be overcome. And even for someone like myself, you might look now at this point, yes, I've written a couple books. Yes, some folks want to give me a title of being a historian, but there was a time for many years I drove by that site, probably in my parents' vehicle, started driving myself well into my adulthood. And I never gave that place a second thought, because I simply knew that was likely an old plantation house. It symbolized and it was telling the story of the lost cause. It didn't speak to me, but it also not only did not speak to me, but it also sent a message that we don't want to speak to you. So for being able to reach out to a place like that, which was happened to be just by luck, that someone, when I was doing some research, someone said two of the names of your ancestors, there was a diary that mentioned individuals by those names getting married. And that kind of led me on, this journey, and eventually finding a diary that had a tremendous amount of information about my ancestors. And I wrote extensively about the inspiration and that I got from visiting the site, but also just the material information as well. Another point was about the Descendants Day that Lori had helped organize. Even when you don't have a lot of the, let's say, the material information there, when you bring together descendants, and for us, that's remembering and honoring our past, like many groups do. So within those stories, you might find a lot of information eventually. I wanted to just very quickly just read something. This was from the diary of the master of two of my ancestors. And she wrote in her diary in 1863, October the 27th. And she said, "Sophia had a daughter last night, only sick about 10 minutes. That just seems like a simple passage. But my family historian, who we credit her for maintaining so much and being that bridge from today to years gone by, and I went to her to learn so much. She had told me that she had learned a lot from her grandmother. And she had said, you know, grandmama never knew when she was born. She never knew her birthday. That's powerful when you think of someone not knowing their birthday, it just being guesswork. And to be able to take the passage from that diary and share it with our family and community historian, it was powerful and emotional for her to now know when her grandmother was born. So that's why, you know, getting information like that can be extremely priceless.
If I could just follow up on that, I think what's also interesting when we talk about white supremacy, all of the inferences and all of the information that we are able to glean are through the white people, the white families, the white people who wrote the diaries. You know, that's incredibly lucky to come across and incredibly wonderful information for descendants to have, but it's rare, it's rare. And so what is left is how do we interpret enslaved people and enslaved populations when we are only looking at the white people's perspective? George Washington did a wonderful job of keeping diaries, and he was incredibly anal, but we're so glad because of that, because we know who was where, who was having a child, who was planting, what was going on, but that's through his eyes, that's it. But we have that information and it's helpful, but now we have to sort of take that, it seems like to me, and then move it over to how do we understand the anger and the trauma from that, is what it seems like to me, of not good enough, marginalized, and we kept you down in all so many ways, even in documentation. We can find your name, we can give that back, but the system was designed for us not even to be able to find it today, is how I view it.
Okay, Lori, go ahead.
And following up on what Kevin and Maddie said, I think sometimes oftentimes at historic sites, the pushback that you get about telling a fuller story is all about what you don't have. And the reality is, I think any place has something that they can take and turn into interpretation, a discussion, a story, or something. So, for example, at Oatlands, there were names, and so and that was very, that was so important to us. But we also at one point, and Kevin was on this project as well, where we got a grant to study the cultural landscape of slavery there, because and to look at how that place was designed from the start in the late 1700s, specifically with enslavement in mind, and trying to document that, but then also turn that into a program that we did. And we did, I think, I don't know, an hour and a half walking tour with that, but looking at it from the perspective of the people who knew that land, who worked that land, who had much more of a connection to the land than the Carters ever did there. And so while there is, if there is no material culture, if a historic site might not have names to be able to discuss, again, I still think that there's something there. And I think it's a cop-out to not acknowledge that you have something. The building itself, if you have a building, is some place to start your story.
I agree 100%, Lori. Simone, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, my perspective is obviously from the mental health sort of side of things, and that having these discussions and beginning this kind of exploration in historic museums and in historic sites is is often very conflicted. I think Laurie had mentioned that a little bit with hers, that people really don't want to do it. So I can talk a little bit about that, sort of like this, how to begin to have the discussion, because it does take a little bit of skill. You can have the will, but you need some skills to be brought in with that too. But even just beginning, before you even get to that point of some skills training, even just beginning from this perspective of, number one, because of the disparity in power, white people have to take the lead, because of when we're beginning those discussions, there is going to be this inequality, and they have to be willing to listen and sit in these very uncomfortable spaces, because whenever you're talking about this kind of experience, it brings up a lot of emotions. But one of the key pieces, and I think Maddie mentioned it a little bit here, and I may have, is that defining the terms, which is when you begin to have these conversations, why there is often so much conflict is because we haven't recognized that we're talking in two different realms. And so from the privileged perspective, we're talking in the realm of intentions. I had pure intentions, or there were pure intentions in the past. And from the subjugated perspective, we deal in the realm of consequences. I don't care what your intentions were, this hurt. And so so our job as a subjugated is to speak up, because we have been voiceless. And so the privileged can keep doing what they're doing because they don't know that they're inflicting hurt. It doesn't occur to them, it's not there. So our point and our job is to speak up and to say something and to engage in the conversation. But the privileged have to be able to do that. So what often happens is, a person of color is going to say, hey, this was a racial slur. I feel really hurt by what you said. And the white person is going to be like, well, that's not what, you misunderstood me. That's not what I intended. And then it becomes again, and the hurt increases, because it becomes again about taking care of the person with the privilege. And another layer of hurt is inflicted. And that's where we, and so we never deal with the hurt. We have to deal with this intention. So if we can understand that we're coming at this from two different spaces, this goes across the board with whatever it is that we're talking about when we're coming in different spaces, the realm of intentions and the realm of consequences. And our job as well as the subjugated people is not just to speak up, but it's also to stop taking care of the privileged, because we've been trained to take care of those in high, because of our safety is dependent upon it, but we've been trained from a young age. And so we need to be able to stop taking care, but to also be respectfully engaged in a conversation that is going to bring up anger and pain and hurt, and still continue to communicate. So that's just my bit about how to have these kinds of conversations, because it's so conflicted and it's so painful. But on the other side of that pain is something bigger.
Thank you. Go ahead, Maddie.
I just wanted to follow up on that. I think that's perfectly said, Simone. And I think that's where a lot of us fall into difficulties, especially when we're doing training at houses. From an educational standpoint, if we want to talk about slavery, we want to train docents how to talk about slavery. And right out from the bat, there are issues because we fall into these historical traps, these historical verbal traps, that we don't realize what we are doing. And that's where I go back to, as white people, we need to educate ourselves on these viewpoints and understanding where we are in this conversation. I now realize, I've been doing this work for almost 15 years and really only started looking at the mental health aspect of it with Simone in the last 9 months. I realize I've been doing my job with one of my arms tied behind my back all of these years. You must have a mental health professional at the table to help you navigate all of these emotions that come up, and in most cases immediately come up. Even the word slavery, people start getting nervous and upset on all ends of the spectrum. So to have that person there at the table with you for educational perspective, for all, but from an educational standpoint, is huge, and it's really, in my opinion, a must-have at this point.
Okay, go ahead, Peyton, and then we'll go to questions, because I know there's a lot.
Just super quickly, because I wanted to bounce off of Simone and what Maddie said as well. Just, I guess, a bit of a personal kind of anecdote. Super recently, within the last year, I found out that I had family that lived in Richmond, and they were also enslaved in Amelia County towards the roughly around the Civil War, the early 1860s. And I found out that my third great-grandfather is buried at a cemetery called Woodland Cemetery. And it's one of 3 cemeteries in Richmond that were horrifically overgrown. The city did not do anything to care for them. And so the only people who are there who are, you know, trying to discover these graves that have been covered by trees and underbrush that have toppled over, that have been split in half, are community members, both white and black, people who know that their families are buried out there. And in my family in particular, it's been a year, it's been almost a year, since July of 2019. I still can't find my third great-grandfather's headstone anywhere. I've gone myself to dig, and I can't find it. The volunteers can't find it. And the only people who seem to consider this to be an important task to undertake are the people who have taken their time to buy the tools, to volunteer, to mow the grass, and to cut the trees down. I mean, I've cut trees down with a chainsaw. I've watched other people have to cut down trees with a chainsaw to try to get this done. And I mean, it's just down to the labor of less than 10 people. And I mean, it's just talking about the mental health aspect of it. I mean, this is genuinely maddening to me. That, I mean, I cannot find this person for who I'm trying to find the grave for. Is my grandmother, who is still living. It was her her great-grandfather who was buried there, who died in 1934. I still can't find them. And I mean, it is absolutely insane. I think that historical sites don't think about that pain enough as they should. The pain of not knowing who your ancestors are, or if you do know who your ancestors are, you can't find information about them, or you're only getting a certain context from documentation that's coming from the letters of white families or the diaries of white families. And so it is extremely important to engage that pain, even though it is difficult to do. And I'm saying that as a Black person who had to come to terms with that on my own, and also had to try to guide people through that same issue as I'm dealing with it myself in a different type of realm. And so, I mean, I just wanted to kind of, you know, just bounce off and discuss that, because it is something that has to be talked about. Because at this point, it's still something that's being swept under the rugs. And if not for those people who bought those tools to cut down those trees and mow that grass, I probably would not even be able to wade through the cemetery to even walk and try to find him at all.
And I will say, historic house museums, which are predominantly staffed by white people and run with leadership boards being predominantly white and have been for decades, have withheld this history purposely. There are archival resources at many historic sites that have a lot of information about enslaved individuals, a lot of information that could be used to better understand and to share with descendants. And so I strongly encourage historic sites to do whatever they need to do to make that information accessible, because it should not be held by that historic site as just a way to tell a better story. It must be returned to the community it belongs to. So with that said, I think we'll go ahead and go to questions. And I think our moderators have been reviewing the questions. I can't watch them and moderate at the same time, so.
Absolutely, this is Levon. I'll just go ahead and start reading some of the ones that we've seen. The first one we have is, have these processes of change in your institutions also disrupted the professional infrastructure? For example, do you pay and hire descendants as permanent staff? Did you recruit descendants or other non-white people from the community for your boards? Can change really happen without these structural alterations?
I'll say to the panel, go ahead and unmute if you'd like to answer. For my historic site, we have been working, our story is set in early 20th century Virginia. And instead of just talking about the owner of the property and his accomplishments, we're now shifting gears to talk more about what Virginia was like at the time that he moved there from New York. So we're shifting it a little bit. We have not had any success in changing the makeup of our board. It's something that we desperately need to work on, and the intention is there, but it will be, we need to show our site-wide intention of prioritizing this history before we can before we can attract the right kind of people, just because we've been a historic site since 1967 and we have never delved into this history before. Would anybody else like to answer?
I would just say very quickly, that's why I believe things like allyship training are so incredibly important. As you know, a white board may not understand why that's important to have more diverse board to even begin with. So once that training, and again, it's tough. It may be a tough sell for some people's sites, but once you start it, you definitely, the eyes, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Let's put it that way.
So to kind of build off that question, Maddie, there were some questions specifically for you around allyship as in the way that you defined it and how you think about allyship training. Can you just expound a little bit on that? And whether the 7 steps you identified, are you thinking about staff only, beyond staff? Just talk a little bit about that as well.
So essentially the steps that I was talking about, the 7 steps, that's sort of where I come in. When I come in to consult at a historic site or a historic house museum, what essentially I take inventory of take the pulse of the organization, so to speak. And allyship training is one of these, again, I'm going to just say exactly what I did before. It's once you start it, you can't really put the genie back in the bottle. It's understanding where we as white people actually are sitting in this entire relationship with our sites, with our communities. It's not just look how we, talking about enslaved people. Your eyes are opened up across the board as far as being a citizen and a community member, and then as a historian. But it is so important that the group goes through this together. And that's where I sort of said, the first step is the entire site commits to doing this. It's going to be hard. And I've seen it at many different sites where people have literally broken down in tears and say, I cannot do this. Docents who said, I'm gone, I'm out. Okay, so you may lose a few people, but then when you start reading, you just sort of start moving into this process and committed process of moving towards this allyship training and allyship understanding, so we can understand how we can then benefit the entire site and benefit the community as well. And again, and change our shifts and our lenses of how we are as individuals.
Yeah, if I can just jump into it, and just to piggyback on what you said, Maddie, what really kind of hit me as well is in those situations where, and again, I'm not in the role of like a staff member, but as a descendant, I really feel like for those professionals, it's not your history. You're basically in the role of being a caretaker of that history, and especially for folks who are very interested in wanting to connect the dots to fit in the missing pieces of that genealogy or family history puzzle. You're there to be a resource, because it's not really your role to get into trying to, what should be shared and what shouldn't. As those of us who are researching families, I will say I've come across all type of stories just on a personal level of researching families that I wish I could put some of the stuff that I've uncovered back in the bottle, but I can't, because I realize that I've started researching these families and their stories. So I think people have to be prepared for that, and being prepared for everything. Being prepared at times. I tell folks, I'm not 25% British by accident. My DNA, it got that way for a reason. So being prepared to come across those stories, but not let the individuals, the researchers, fit together the pieces of those puzzles, because you will uncover a lot, such as those familial connections between the enslaved and the slave master, and not to start
freaking out to what you want to do with it. That's history. It is what it is, and then people will deal with that accordingly. But when you get into, oh, well, we're not really sure if we should share this or what will happen, it's not yours in the first place.
Right, we're only stewards for the information and for the landscapes and for the history.
So
Yeah, right on.
Another question that we had was thinking about this place that often organizations that don't have a lot of representation on their staff get into. What happens when some of the white staff members are uncomfortable and that turns into animus between them and possibly a staff person of color? And anybody can feel free to jump in on that.
Just real quickly, and I'm going to defer to someone like Simone who's got the experience with that. But I think we're seeing a pattern here, and I think they're great questions. But I think it's really going back to that training that has been talked about. I mean, and someone like Simone can probably explain how you deal with that, because it's not just for staff, but even for those reactions of coming to. I mean, imagine someone who's experienced sexual abuse themselves, and then they discover just through their research, that there's some pieces of a puzzle that they realize that they had an ancestor who was born out of sexual assault. I mean, imagine those type of reactions. Again, that's where I think it goes to the training of someone like Simone, what you could probably speak to in those situations.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Kevin. It's like, so every situation is going to be different, but I think as you begin this process, you have to have the will. It has to start with the privileged population of, which is what this is mostly, and there will be, like, I was going to say, like, even with working with Maddie and some of the things that she does, sometimes she needs a space to just talk about it, because it's so painful. It's painful on both sides of the equation. It's painful to sit and have somebody rage at you, just as it is to sit with somebody, who doesn't understand what it is that you and your ancestors have been through and why you feel the way that you do. It's incredibly complicated. And so having the will and the desire, and then going to the training, whichever kind of training it is that is needed, really makes all the difference to begin to have those kinds of conversations. And I do think that there can be a lot that can be done. You can't fix everything. It's not the museum's necessarily responsibility to take care of everybody as they come through the door, but you can prep people before that this is traumatic material, and there are wonderful examples of ways that you can do that. There's nothing perfect, and it's always a work in progress, and it's the willingness and the desire from the top down all the way down to the bottom, to go forward and to confront these very difficult and painful issues, and to sit with uncomfortable feelings. It brings up the problem with racial oppression and racial disparities and things like that, is it brings up shame, and it brings up shame on both sides. So, and shame is one of those emotions that nobody likes. We have immediate reactions to that, get away. And one of the biggest responses to that on both sides of shame, whether you're the abused or the abuser, is to push it off. The problem is with the privileged get to push it off onto the abused, onto the subjugated, and it's moving away from these spaces. But we have to move into these uncomfortable spaces. We have to sit with them. We have to sometimes have arguments and disagreements and walk away and come back to the table. And that is, it takes a lot. And so having that desire, that motivation, that willingness to step into that is the first part. And then bringing people in. If you can't negotiate, you have to be able to bring in somebody to kind of mediate these kinds of conversations.
I would also say that over the years, there are numerous excuses for why this is too hard or too scary to start. And I think that you must be responsible and take your steps carefully, but it's more important to move forward than to not move at all. And so I think all of us have made mistakes. I know I have, and I probably will continue to make mistakes. And I apologize and try to learn and try to keep going. But if you focus too much on the what ifs, you can end up just holding still. And I think that's a little bit more dangerous than trying to keep moving forward. So I would just caution everyone to be thoughtful, but have that intention to go forth and do the best you can with the resources you have, because not all of our sites can afford to hire a mental health professional and to pay for top of the line training and things like that. So you do what you can, read what you can, find the people who can help support you in moving forward, and just keep pushing forward.
It looked like perhaps Maddie had something to say on that. Okay, all right. The next question that we have is, what helps bridge the idea of needing to tell these stories to needing to make tangible changes institutionally and actively paying out or supporting reparations as a historic site?
I just joined, excuse me, I beg your pardon. I am on working with the Virginia Theological Seminary now that have decided to go ahead and give reparations to individuals that were enslaved by their board, by their staff, not by students, but anybody who may have been part of the institution and had enslaved individuals that were their own enslaved individuals, or being hired in and out from the seminary. We're looking for people who then we can now start and find their descendants, and then to actively give financial reparations. And so I think we should also clarify, there's a big, there's financial reparations, and then there are reparations that can be given in other ways, and but we're talking financial. It is a very, again, and nothing against the seminary, I think that they're doing absolutely the right thing, but this is where it's very, very tricky as far as what are we going to do and how much are we going to do it? Because when you have designated a fund of, let's say, $1 million for reparations for untold individuals that we will hopefully find, and yet your art budget, and art is very important in this world, absolutely, but your art budget's $34 million. That what are you setting up? What are you saying to the community? And that's not exactly what's going on there, but I'm just saying that that's the type of thing that's happening at a lot of institutions, where we are not, it's tokenism. We are sort of saying, here we go, we're going to try and we're going to try and do right. It's that intention again. And that's where I'm going to come back to this every single time. The mental health aspect of this, again, I have not been able to do my job appropriately without this mental health aspect of this. So we can understand what we're walking into and all of the feelings, because when we start saying financial reparations, the emotional response to that is incredible as well. So I'm gonna stop there.
Did anyone else want to speak to that? Okay, well,
I'll add something real quick. I think reparations is a big question, and as Maddie kind of indicated, there's no right course for that. I think that's a bigger national issue that we can all play a role in. We at Morven Park are currently working on a project called the 246 Years Project, which is to create a nationwide genealogical database of all enslaved individuals in the United States. We have been asked if we're doing this to support reparations or for any other kind of those big national movements. And my answer is that we're creating this for individuals to have a resource to find their ancestors, period. And then that information can be used going forward, and however it's best, however those families want to use that information. So we're hoping the project's been put on temporary hold right now due to the pandemic, but when it resumes, we hope to be able to be reaching out to historic sites and archives across the nation to include information in this database so that people can find ancestors and trace their family lines back as far as the records allow. So to me, that's the most important step right now, is giving access to the information. Because without that information, you can't even begin to start talking about how you can make reparations or anything else.
Great, thank you. So we're coming around to the last parts of our discussion today. I just want to give all the panelists an opportunity to make any last points they might like to make. So just want to give some space for that. Okay, well, thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. This is a great conversation. Wanted to bring back up my screen real quick for 1 second. Just wanted to say thanks to everyone, and all of the donations that we've received as part of this conference are going to be donated to the Museum Workers Relief Fund. Everything about this conference is volunteer run, volunteer done, and so we are really, really grateful for your support in any way, shape, or form, and we are giving that support back to the Museum Workers Relief Fund during the pandemic. So again, thank you all for your time, and thank you all for taking some time to be with us today. Appreciate it. And you all can unmute if you want to say your goodbyes as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yep,
Yeah.
thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well.
All right, have a great day.
Thank you.